Hello, Diana.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Good. I'm in
Great.
I'm in a room with the sun's coming in with the blinds, and I may go into light and shadow, which is part of art too, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The light and shadow.
Absolutely. So welcome to the festival. It's great to have you here, especially since we had a couple of section speakers that didn't really work out. So we've just been kind of chatting away, lounge style here. But yeah, really happy that you can join us and share what you're going to be speaking about, playing in the field, intuitive painting and facilitating systemic constellations
hmm
is the title you gave. So welcome.
Well, thank you. I feel like others have said, I feel very honored and pleased to be part of this. And I just found out in the last couple of days I'm going to be coming to your April event in person. So that's
Yay!
yeah, with Anne Marie in the Hague Center. So yeah, so here I am. So I did do a little bit of hello there. I Nice to see you. I did do a little preparation on your questions that you asked. So do you want me to just start with some of that? Like I allowed myself to think a bit ahead.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. So you asked one of the questions was why do I do what I do, or what's the unique part of what I do? And I really consider creativity my home, and imagination is, vital to me and has been since I was tiny. And so uh, I've always named myself an artist, whether I've been doing art or what we would traditionally call art or not. I inside me, in my deepest part, I feel I'm an artist. So there's a teaching that I'm not even sure if the original teacher, I know his first name is Michael, but called Archetypes of the Soul. And they talk about 7 archetypes of the soul. There's I have to refer to my notes to remember, the healer, the artist, the warrior, the scholar, the sage, the priest, and the emperor or empress. And for me, I'm very clearly the artist, researcher, or sage, um, the scholar, sorry, artist scholar archetype, the mix of that. And one of the things when I was studying this, we learned was right now coming to the planet are way more artists, people who live inside the artist archetype than previously. And I think that's a really interesting message about where we are, because we do need, as your conversation that you just had was all about, is we do need to make the shift from the devaluation of art to and imagination, the dismissal of it, to actually honoring it and respecting the arts. So I guess what I bring, the question was like, why do you do what you do? I don't feel I actually have any choice in it because it's who I am at the deepest level. And the expression, how it's come through me, has manifested in many different ways in my life. So how I've started to see things is that I am in relationship with a creative force. And the creative force, there is a great creative force, but there's a particular creative force that moves through me and moves me and calls me and pushes me. And that my job is to be in a respectful, loving um, relationship with that force, no matter where it's going to take me. because it takes me. It's not about where I'm going to actually take myself, but how is that? How can I be in integrity with that force that's much bigger than I am? And so, in the conversation you were just having, I would add that what is really vital in the shift to this new paradigm is that we actually do honor the creative force that moves through us and become conscious of it. Because there's an example of the creation of the atomic bomb was a creation, but there was an unconsciousness in the creators in terms of the consequences of creating that bomb. So I think that for me, that's a piece that I bring and would love to talk more with others about is how to be in right relationship with the creative force that moves through us and moves through everything on the planet. So anyway, so I'm doing my different forms of art because I really don't have any choice. I mean, I guess somewhere, my soul made a commitment to being, that I was going to be in tune with this creative force. So the ways it's come through my life is once I reached adulthood, when I had my kids in my 20s, and the creative force really, besides birthing children, really started to move in me, and so I taught myself all sorts of arts and crafts, and I fell in love with quilting, but it always had to be my own design, not some other design. And then I studied fiber as an art form, so and developed a teaching program for that, and started teaching in a fashion design department. So that was sort of a whole area of my life. And then I moved into using arts for healing transformation as I became a counselor working with adult survivors of childhood trauma. This is in the 80s. So I used all the arts. You talked about using arts with mental illness, that you can doodle, you can color, you can do tissue collage. I mean, they can be basic. So I really got into using arts as a healing art form. And then in the 90s, I got into drawing angels. I was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and these angels came through. I don't know if you can see behind me. I can show you one of them. They're, can you see that? So they're little, they're small little doodles, actually, that were created into books for children. And they're black and white doodles, so kids color them, and the angels actually play with them. So I did that, and that took me into self-publishing and helping others self-publish, so in the writing publishing. So again, the creative force is moving me in different, in directions. And usually with each form, I created a business. So there was also business is an art form in the entrepreneurial thing. And then as coming into the 2000s, I was doing adult education and eventually came into systemic constellation work. And I just want to check how many of you know systemic constellation work. I know Jan knows about it. And do I need to describe it a bit? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Please.
Thank you.
So for me, it's my present art form. And it's something that I do with people that allows for creativity as well as co-creativity. And I believe for me, it's really a major tool for us to use as we move into this new paradigm to help us make the transition. So yeah, so that's where I come from. Also a long-term spiritual journey connected with all of my art. So do you have any questions out of that, or what?
What kind of art is it? Constellation? I'm not familiar with your art form.
Can you speak more to
Well,
systemic constellation?
okay, so systemic constellation work, just as a little background, it's a philosophy of life. It's also a body of teachings based on living system principles, and it's a process. And I'll go into the process in a minute. And it's a worldwide community of practitioners. So it started with Bert Hellinger, who's a German philosopher, and he was a Catholic priest sent to Zululand in South Africa and really tuned into their way of being and brought the seed from the Zulus that when we're in right relationship with our ancestors, life can flow smoothly, and came back to Germany, left the priesthood, and began synthesizing many, many different processes of the 60s and 70s. So transactional analysis, Virginia Satir's family sculpting, different deep processes, primal things. And his own way of working emerged out of that synthesis, that where you take what's inside and place it outside yourself and create an image on any issue. You can do it one-on-one, and when we do that, what you put outside to create the image might be pieces of paper or foam mats or little objects. When we do it in a group, people become the representatives for what we're taking from inside us and put it out. And what we're looking for, so you create essentially a map in the center of a circle or a sacred space, and that shows a picture of what is, often at a level that we can't in our little minds see or understand. So it allows us to allows the invisible to become clear and visible. And Anne-Marie's done it. So with me, I've been working with Integral City that was mentioned earlier in the conversation, and with the Hague Center, we've been using the process for many applications, but team building and collaboration and creating and making decisions and gathering collective intelligence. And so you can apply it in many, 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 many different ways. Yeah, it's one of those things that it's an experiential embodied process, so it's very hard. I find the languaging of it limits what it actually is. So I'm hoping, of course, in the April event that we'll actually do it and use it, because I do see that part of the movement in constellation work itself is it's been originally was for individuals in their family system, and then it moved to organizational systems and working with that. And now there's an emergence, a sort of almost a new branch where we're using it for societal issues and collective constellations. So you can take large issues like a city, for instance. We're using it in Integral City with cities. Or you can do it with an issue like the refugee crisis. I know that it's being used in Europe for that quite a bit. Or we can do how to come in right relation with Indigenous people, which is a very big issue for us in Canada at the moment. I think elsewhere too, but it's present time in Canada where I'm living. So we can use it in very large issues. So my personal evolution, and I believe for our community of constellators, is this: let's use this amazing tool that allows us to bring what's been hidden forward and unblock what's blocked in the flow of life, and let's bring it forward to apply it to these larger scale issues. So that's where the excitement is for me, is to be part of the field that I work in emerging itself, and bring that together with this movement, or the movement of movements, because I think it could be one of the many tools, creative tools, we can use to develop the movement. So, yeah. Does that help a lot, or do you want an actual example of what we do? Sorry, there's a bus goes by, so there's a noise.
Well, I really appreciate the sketch that you've given us, and I imagine that working with people is um, it's like using a paintbrush when you've been just sketching things, and you get to use a paintbrush. And then when you work with integral cities, you're fully into body art. This sounds to me like a very powerful way for you to be the artist that you came here to be.
Hmm.
You must feel very passionate about what you do.
Yeah, for me it was finding, I do feel totally passionate about it. I love the work. I know I'm absolutely in the right place when I do it, both with individuals and when I've done the larger scale constellations. Yeah, even though it can be very difficult issues, or there can be a heaviness to the issue, as a facilitator, my role, and this is where the playing in the field and my intuitive painting came in, that there's what I need to do is empty myself, and I think of myself as an empty reed, to allow the flow of energy and information to come through me, and also to be resonating with the people in the circle with me to do it. And the interesting thing for me was I did this intuitive painting process for 10 years prior to me coming into constellation work. And I did it because it was fun. And I loved painting, and I also taught others. So the process was to just put paint on paper. This, by the way, is a way for people who don't feel creative to find out they can be creative. And I used it a lot for this painting technique. So you just put paint on paper. You're not trying to paint anything. You don't have to know anything, nothing. You just play, play, play. And then I'll bring a painting because I've got one. So I don't know. Can you actually see this painting?
We sure can.
Okay.
Beautiful.
So in this case, it stayed abstract as the final piece, but I'll show you the process if I had developed this painting. So I just played with colors here, and then at some point it said stop, that's enough. And then the next stage would be to look into the painting and see what you can see. Now, each of you will see something different than I would see, because that shows us about our perception. And there's been a lot of talk this morning around we need to learn to perceive differently. Well, this is partly a training in that, because when you do it in a group, you actually learn that we all are going to see something different in here. And then you can see something different too, right? So that what we do is you turn in all four directions and look into the painting. And there's there'll be four, there can be way more than four paintings, but there could be four paintings. And again, each of you would see something different from what I saw when I created this painting. Okay. Now the next stage, if I were going to do that, would be to actually paint that. So to make a more traditional painting, to bring out. So let's say, in this case, I didn't do it, but this could be quite a fetal here. And there could be an unborn baby painted in here. And I could have developed that. I chose not to. I wanted to just leave it as it satisfied me as it was. But anyway, so then I bring that out. And what this taught me was I was just allowing the creative force to move through me in each of those stages. And I wasn't thinking I knew what I was painting or what I needed to do or trying to paint anything outside of me or inside me. It was like, just be empty. And that turned out to be the best training I could have had to become a constellation work facilitator. But I didn't know that when I was painting. I was just painting, right? That's how creativity came through me. So, so that was a learning to play in a field, really to become very comfortable about just allowing. So, so that's how the title of my talk said. I said I was going to talk about playing in the field. The field that we work in constellation work, we call the knowing field. Some people call it the informing field. And for me, that's this sacred energy that we work with that has way more than I could ever say. But when I work in it, I call in the great mystery, and then I acknowledge Bert Hellinger and the facilitators who've brought the work forward and the thousands of constellations. And then we always acknowledge our lineages. So the mother and father line for everybody who's attending. So there's a connection with the ancestral line that brings us here. And then when I work, I open it to the group and invite them to bring whatever supports from whatever dimensions they want to bring in. Because for me, working in the knowing field, it's a sacred multidimensional field that I work in. Other facilitators wouldn't see it that way. So that's one of the delights about constellation work is we get to, the field works through each facilitator in its own particular way. So, you could have 20 constellations with 20 different facilitators and you'd get a different take on constellation work. So I like that. It's like abundant, in the creativity. Yeah.
Diana, may I ask you something?
Yeah.
Yeah. We have indeed, you know that here at the Maestrom building and here in Rotterdam, United Earth, we're aiming to synergize different solutions and tools and technologies that are already existent out there in the world. And we've sent you a number of questions beforehand, before the presentation. And I would like to specifically ask you one question, and maybe you could see what your vision is about that. And one of the questions I remember was, what ideas do you have, or could you perhaps share with us in terms of how artists could co-create and collaborate more effectively together? And it would be wonderful if you could share your ideas so we can actually map them we can see whether there's possibility for synergy.
Okay, so I had two ideas in the general co-creative thing, and then I also would like to put into the circle of something I've been imagining for several years and hasn't manifested, but I think this is maybe the time to put it forward. What came to me around how do we collaborate and co-create more effectively is, all of us coming together in the movement of movements. The first was, I've mentioned it, but I'll just state it again. I really feel that we need to respect and honor the creative force in each of our lives. And in doing that, we'll be taking responsibility for our own lives also. So that, I think, is a really vital part of the shift into the new paradigm, that we are fully responsible for our own lives. And the other thing, and this is a very constellation work kind of a statement that comes out of the body of teachings, but I feel that we need to know where we belong, each of us needs to fully know where we belong in ourselves, in our family and ancestry, on the land that we come from, and in our souls. So again, it's a multi-dimensional process there. And to live there, to actually allow ourselves to live there. And, you know, what I experience with the clients I work with, both organizational and individuals, is most of us have, there can be an issue of belonging, and it could be because we don't feel we really belong in our family for some reason, or it can be that in our family history there was displacement. Most of us in our family lineages have been moved around in some way, and of course we're now seeing with the refugee crisis, that's a huge issue, the belonging issue, and who welcomes whom and stuff like that. So that for me is a really big piece, is that if each of us knew where we fully belonged, we could find we would be able to actually express more fully and passionately who we are and bring our gifts fully to this collaborative thing. If we don't know where we belong, we usually feel diminished or competitive or striving, or a lot of the old ways. So those were the two thoughts that came up about how could we collaborate.
I
Yeah?
really like your about belonging, and it brings to mind the need for security. And if we don't feel secure, it's very hard to be creative. And so to affirm your sense of belonging in the world, and your being an intrinsic part of the patterns that make up the environment within which you dwell, that sure sense will enable people to feel more creative. Being always worried about whether you've got a roof over your head can really interfere with your creativity. So I'm really hoping that some of the ideas that have come up today will come up as United Earth becomes more entrenched in our world. I think we're going to see some major changes happening, and a vast change in the amount of creativity that is allowed to be in people's lives.
Well, we've already seen that shift, because creativity and imagination and innovation are really major buzzwords in the organizational field now. I did a major research project on the imagination in 2000 and interviewed 120 people on it. And at the time, I haven't published it because at the time there was such pushback to doing something on the imagination. It was incredible. Like, it was still so dismissed as vital. And now that's not true. Imagination, the people in leading edge organizational work, imagination and creativity is like, that's where the action is. That's it. So we're already seeing this. To me, that's part of the shift into the new paradigm. They're already, as Barbara Marx Hubbard says, you can see there's some of the signs. Well, one of those is, okay, we're starting to value imagination and creativity again. Paul Ray, of course, spoke about the cultural creative, so that was a whole naming of a movement. Oh, we've got another person on. Okay, we're starting to value imagination and creativity again.
Hello, Mark.
Paul Ray, of course, spoke about the cultural creative, so that was a whole naming of a movement. Oh, we've got another. I don't know. I think, because there's a new person, should I say goodbye?
You're back now. Is it time for Mark Yeah.
No, I'm just hanging out. I can be off again.
Oh, okay. Well, hang in there, and let's continue with Diana.
Yeah, let Diana finish.
Um, the other, the big shift in the new paradigm, and you mentioned it in your earlier discussion, and Anne Marie and I were part of a constellation that we did with Jonathan, actually, who spoke first this morning on using the wheel of co-creation and looking at the role of money. And what came out of there is that the arts is actually needs to be seen as the transformational way for the sectors to for society, the sectors of society to come together. So it needs to be really at the core of what we do. And I do think we're getting a few little clues that people are waking up to that notion. So I feel hopeful about that. I just want to put into the circle, because this is my imagination. There was a question about where do you see your project going. Well, I do see this collective constellation and the emergence of that. So I've been imagining a worldwide group called the Allies in Wholeness Everywhere, AWE as an acronym, AWE, who would come together to do collective constellations on a regular basis and when called by global events. So my desire would be to birth awe, and that it be a vibrant and abundant contributor to this movement and the movement of movements. Through the work with the Hague Center and Integral Cities, we've developed a process where we can do systemic constellation work long distance. There can be multiple people and multiple geographical locations, so we're not limited to doing it in where it's usually done, but limited by an in-person group. And I think that process could be applied for my Allies in Wholeness Everywhere collective constellations. So I just wish to offer that as a possibility that let us seed it.
Yay.
I love it. I wish you the very best of luck, and I certainly hope that you come to help co-create it right here.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking forward to being there in a month.
You're coming in a month. That's
Yay.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yay.
Well,
Great.
thank you all for this. It's been a great opportunity for me. I really appreciate it, and I honor what you're doing. So.
Thank you. Well, you're definitely part of it, Diana.
Blessings, everybody.
Thank you so
Blessings.
much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yay.
We'll see you soon.
Applause to say goodbye and applause to welcome. Hello, Mark.
Hello, just a sec.
Hey.
Let me come and sit with you.
Yes, come and sit with me.
Hi. How nice to see you again, Mark.
You too, Shannon. And yeah,
Hey, yes. Welcome, welcome. Well, we're nearly halfway through now already. It's been really amazing. I have to apologize as well for the last minute shift in technology, but you seem to have figured it out. You've got a bit more time than the others.
it's called rebooting your computer.
Yeah. Okay.
Good.
Good. So I'd like to hand you the floor and share with us why you do what you do and all that good stuff.
Well, it was great listening to Anna talk about, I think we're, in so many ways we're all artists, and absolutely time is the most precious thing. So as an economist who wrote the best-selling book, The Economics of Happiness, in 2007, so I was a little early into the game, but obviously, as in surfing, there's always a good wave, and I caught the wave. So now I think there's a new wave forming, because it seems like after 7 or 8 years, you have to get another wave.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about what I think the new wave is going to be, which is the title of my next book, I hope, The Economics or the Economy of Well-Being. As I explained in the first book, a lot of what we're dealing with is the misinterpretation of the language we use. So the word economy in Greek means household management or stewardship. The word competition in Latin means to strive together. The word mortgage in French means a death pledge, but we use it in the English world to define the most important thing we invest in, which is our home. The most important asset we have. 20% of Americans will spend, 20% of American spending will be on the house, on the home. But embedded in that cost is interest cost, which is a great scourge, the scourge of usury, which a lot of people in the sustainability movement don't understand. That the biggest challenge we face, I don't think, is, yes, there's climate change, but it's this embedded cost of debt and money in our system, and something I'm working on to alleviate. And I believe once you solve the money system issue, the living wage, guaranteed income, all those things that we're all trying to work on just take care of themselves. I've estimated a third of Americans' lives will be spent working for interest payments which are embedded in every dollar they spend. And this is a great injustice, because if some of you know, Shannon knows, and David knows, money is simply a social invention, something we created out of our imagination. And if we don't reclaim our sovereignty over money and how it's created, and if it's created in parallel with our well-being aspirations and needs, it's a whole different world. I listen to some of the home building ideas. All these things are possible, but if we're stuck, especially in the place where banking, I should say, debt money banking started in Amsterdam, then infected London through William of Orange, a Dutchman, right?
Yeah.
How many years ago? 400 years ago?
Karma.
Karma. I said, from New Amsterdam to Old Amsterdam and back and to London, that's where we got to start. That's where we got to reboot the matrix.
Yeah.
And so I, as Shannon knows, I have a crazy, amazing life where last year I was in the House of Lords with the Queen's banker's wife. Her name is Lady Penny Money. I almost called her Money Penny because I thought she must have been the James Bond person. So one of my passions is redesigning this financial architecture so that money is no longer a master, that we're no longer slaves to this usury system. To go see Pope Francis say, change the system, declare a jubilee for the entire world. What is a jubilee? Well, the Jews had laws, right? They had these Jewish laws before they went into exile in Babylon to forgive debts every 7 years, to redistribute the wealth of the 12 tribes every 50 years, called Jubilee. So notice the patterns of 7. 7, the Sabbath, 7th day, the 7th year, and then 7 times 7, 49, the redistribution of wealth. All of these laws were in place, and our supposition is perhaps after they came back from the exile in Babylon, they didn't practice it anymore. They forgot about it. That was a long time ago. So how are we going to bring into practice what seems to have been great wisdom? How come 7, right? There's patterns. Shannon knows. There's why numbers, right? Why the circle? Why the Taoists have 8, right? Aspects. All of these numbers matter. So being an economist, I love numbers. I love drowning in statistics. And one of the statistics I've worked on is this notion of, if all the people, there's 5.8 billion people on this planet who make less than $10 a day. There's 1,700 billionaires. If they cut a check for 0.5% of their wealth every year, Bill Gates got together with his buddies. If he was hanging out with us right now, I challenge Bill to say, and Melinda, cut a check of 0.5%, get all your buddies, and you would pay 5.8 billion people $10 a day. We're eliminating poverty instantly. I mean, in the sense of financial poverty. I'm not saying all the other material and spiritual poverty doesn't persist, but we could do it. We could solve poverty like that, but we don't. So why don't we, right? Ego, fear, greed, whatever blocks us from acting in virtue. So these are my passions. I calculate living wage for Edmonton. I'm working on an amazing project in Cincinnati to create the first interest-free Jubilee Fund to put low-income households into affordable living. They can live there debt-free for a lifetime, and we're about to launch, hopefully in the fall, with various churches. The Christ Church Cathedral, which was endowed by Procter and Gamble, those two families went to that church. So we're going to kind of come at it from a faith perspective. With Walter Brueggemann, who's my mentor now, 82-year-old Old Testament scholar, who reminds me, Mark, you have to help us come out of the slavery of Egypt, because we're slaves in Egypt, but we don't even know it. So who's going to be Moses? Who's going to follow us? You guys are come on, let's go to this promised land. Where's the promised land? You're going to follow us, or a bunch of hippie wackos, artists, right? Earth dollar wackos.
Mark, we don't have to go anywhere.
Exactly.
We're already living in the garden.
Well, I would say we already left the matrix. I mean, we're looking back on it going, I remember Paul Hawken once telling me, you know who Paul Hawken is, College of Commerce. He goes, it's really about just building a parallel operating system. You got the Titanic, it's already hit the iceberg, they're still playing the music, they're still drinking the Kool-Aid, and we come along with this beautiful sailing ship, and we're drinking, martinis or whatever. We're having way more fun. And so it's about showing people that there's an alternative, there's a parallel operating system here that we ourselves have to emulate, model, live in, get frustrated in, have our sharing circles, practice all of those arts, those tools, and just get on with it. And it'll be, as Buckminster Fuller said, how are you going to change a system? By building something that's more compelling, an alternative. What did the art of war teach us? Lao Tzu, that's the art of war. Compel your enemy that your ideas are more compelling. So that's about all I'll say. Well, I'll open it up to conversation, because it's all about conversation. There's tons of ideas. There's tons of models. There's just inaction. In particular, from the top, I think we are afraid of those elite who sit in secret at the Bilderberg meetings or the World Economic Forum in Davos, right? And we're like, oh, they're making all the rules. Well, in part they are. They're establishing the global business plan. We're not there, right? We're not hanging out with George Soros. All right. But I've sent personal challenges to Soros, right, about how we can change the world. I've sat with the Bhutanese Prime Minister. So how are we going to act in the face of what appears to be this kind of catastrophe with love? And I'm serious about when I talk about building a civilization of love. Sometimes I was called the most dangerous man in the South Pacific when I went to Tahiti, and I said, look, dudes, your island is called the Island of Love, that James Cook called it for some reason. You're Maori, you're fierce, you're tongue-wagging, fierce warriors, and you don't even know your brand. So how are you going to establish a new economy based on love, if that's even possible? The power of love, the energy of love. And the word power in French means to be able, so the power of love is... So I would jokingly say, what are we doing? We got our love lasers on stun. We've got them in the closet, and we don't even use them. We're so afraid of whatever we're afraid of. So there's nothing to fear. Anyways, I'm an economist that loves to design new stuff, shake the tree. I'm fearless. I'm not afraid of anything. Anything's possible. So that's me.
Could you maybe speak to one of the crazy inventions you had very appropriately? The Earth dollar has also come into the field. We spoke about it. We spoke with David at the con. Could you maybe share more about that?
Well, the Earth dollar is something that I've been working on off the side of my desk with David and Shannon and others. And the notion is, I have mixed feelings about it, so I'll just be upfront.
Sure.
I don't think it's about, I've said to David many times, it's nice to imagine that we create a new currency to replace the current fiat. The reason we call them fiat currencies, the word fiat means to be It's what Mary said, the angel Gabriel, to be created out of nothing, out of thin air. So we could create any money we want out of backed by anything we decide. So the Earth dollar, the notion is that it's going to be tied to Mother Nature, to natural capital, natural assets. And the notion was that we can perhaps tie it to indigenous natural assets. So Aboriginal lands and title in Canada has never really been ceded by First Nations. So as an accountant and economist, I know that if a nation, and I'm talking about nations now, there's 640 distinct nations in Canada that are First Nation, would declare themselves as a sovereign entity and actually organize themselves around, an asset-based model where natural assets and traditional use are their foundations, then we can create money against that asset. We don't even have to create an Earth dollar. We just create. I understand banking, so I understand what William of Orange, I think, kind of imagined when he invaded London and infected them with the idea of fractional reserve banking. And so we can create money against an asset. And the question is, well, what's the asset delivering? So land delivers benefits, right? Clean, the ecosystem, watersheds, clean water, they clean air, they provide food and wildlife and sustenance and all these ecological services that are way more valuable than the GDP that we derive from them. So we could then create this Earth dollar as a derivative, in relationship with the goals of maintaining the integrity of a watershed and ecosystem. That becomes the goal. So I can optimize, I can create a living wage out of it. I can create enough work so that there's 95% employment, that people have joy in their lives. People are using their gifts, as Shannon knows, like what are our gifts? So we can create this new economy experimentally in Canada, for example, with a First Nation. And First Nations are small enough. The Algonquin are big. They're 10,000 people, the First Nation we looked at. But so that's my take on the Earth dollar. And the problem with creating a currency, unfortunately, is that it's a declaration of war against the sovereign currency, the national currency. So David, I think, has some really cool ideas about, well, isn't this could it be like air miles and people just, will adopt it as an alternative to the Canadian dollar or U.S. dollar, and that might work. But I actually think we could be even bolder, as what I've just said, is that we can. I've been counseling First Nations to, just like any accountant would do, prepare a proper balance sheet, know what your assets are, know that you have the power to create your own money, which is called leverage, right? Through your own institution, you create your own credit union, whatever the financial institution you want to create, and Bob's your uncle, so to speak. Now, some chiefs get it. Some people are like, whoa, this is... I said, I know you used to use seashells and stuff like that for money, but we're in the modern world now. So with the power of banking behind you, the power of fractional reserve that still exists, you can do these amazing things. And you don't have to go groveling for money from the banks. Think about it. The banks just have a corporate license to create money out of thin air anyways. And it's not backed by anything. Right? It's not backed by real assets. So that's what I think is so exciting about what. So David was the first guy I've met in many years. There's a few people who understand the money system, but David understands it. I think Shannon, you understand it. So it's very exciting what's possible.
In terms of the basic income, right, what you call living wage, I guess there are different names for it. I only started to hear about this maybe a year and a half ago, and at that time, whenever I spoke to somebody, there was a lot of ridicule. And there's kind of there's this saying that crazy ideas, new ideas. At first they're ridiculed, then they're vehemently opposed, and then everybody just kind of wonders why they weren't implemented before. And where do you see the evolution of basic income now on a global scale and its feasibility to actually be implemented, or to really gain that public recognition that that it becomes a public choice?
Well, I've lived long enough to know that Justin's father tried, Pierre Trudeau, introduced these ideas in the 70s. And so in Manitoba, as I think in the basic universal income paper that David and others have put together, we have had experiments in Manitoba where a third of the people were found not to be making living wage. So if you bump up their wage, in fact, you get lower health costs. There's a net economic benefit from paying people sufficient income. It actually makes net economic sense to do so. So even when you have the evidence, there's a tendency, and look at the polling results of Switzerland. 49% would approve of a basic income idea, but 47% would disapprove. So you still have that's not that the approval rate isn't high enough, in my opinion. When you get to 65 or 70%, maybe you've got some serious buy-in. So I think because what happens is there's this tendency to think, well, a living wage, a guaranteed income is like a free check, like you could just sit on the couch, right? It's like, no, somehow we have to ensure that the living wage is tied to dignity of work. Like, we can't just say it's an institutionalized laziness program. So that has to be carefully thought through. But my point in living wage actually is that I'm on the poverty task force in Edmonton for the city here, and I've argued that what we need to do as business people is, well, first of all, we need to know what is a living wage. Well, a living wage is the amount of money you need to function in any given society. It's going to be different in Bangladesh or Karachi than Edmonton, but it's based on the cost of actually having a decent living. And once you know that number, of course, that number is rarely reported. We report minimum wage and things like that. Governments come up with those policies. But if you know that the living wage, let's say, is actually 15% or more higher than the minimum wage, and you're a business person, you really, it's kind of a moral challenge or conviction, saying, are you paying your employees a living wage without even adopting a government kind of wide policy? That would be, to me, my first challenge to the business community. And a lot of that's just about awareness. People they're not aware of what a living wage is in this city. And so when we deal with poverty, and that's my frustration with the poverty task force work, is like everyone thinks, it's funny when you come down and say, ask people, what is poverty? Define it. Well, everyone it's all over the map, right? Even Statistics Canada doesn't have a clear definition of it. But intuitively people say it's not having enough money, right, to live. I got to go to the food bank. I got to have 3 jobs. I'm a single mom. Like, it's outrageous, right? So if we kind of tie it back to the sufficiency of monetary and material needs for a decent life to participate in society, then I can cost that, right? So that's my. So I think there's growing interest and awareness. The economic rationale for doing it, as I said, is pretty clear. It's compelling. It will actually save society money because we'll have less social programs, right? We'll actually have one of the greatest programs I've just studied is the Habitat for Humanity model, which is building homes without interest, with principal-only mortgages to put low-income households into decent homes, with sweat equity. I mean, it's a brilliant model of it's just brilliant. So there's all these kind of different angles at this guaranteed. And again, what is guaranteed income but just knowing that this is the amount of money you need to have a good life. And the living wage could be much lower than even those what we're estimating now, because if we strip out the interest costs of the economy, you get basically a 2/3 of. Anyways, I'm digressing about and getting into the weeds.
I think your comment about interest, if you take interest away from the equation, well, how do you see that ever happening?
Yeah, but
how does it come about?
It has to be a global catastrophe. It has to be a global implosion of the system. Right now, my father has got a bank account in Germany. the German, I think it's a postal service bank. You see, they're saying, we don't want your money anymore. We don't want your euros. No more cash in our accounts because it's actually a burden. So we're now into negative interest territory. So we know that what happens with debt systems is it take about 50 years to. So since World War II, you see the debt money keeps growing. So in the United States, the debt mountain is now 60 trillion, and it can't be repaid. That's what people don't understand. It's not like your mortgage, because all money is debt. So over time, mathematically, it grows, and it becomes parabolic. So globally, every nation's in debt. Think about that. How is that possible? Every nation's in debt. Even Norway's in debt. Like Norway's got $1 trillion petroleum fund, and they're still in debt. Like none of this makes sense, right? So
No.
what we have is and people who know the system know that it's ready to implode. It's going to implode. It's just a matter of time. So the question is, when it implodes, like Iceland imploded, like Greece is imploding, like Ireland and Spain is on, even Germany is on the tipping point, right? What are we going to put in its place? Well, in those times of crisis, in the Depression era, the Weimar Republic, right? We have examples of what happened when it imploded. Even Hitler knew what to do, right? Whether but he had some. Anyways, I'm not saying anything about that era, but only to say that in those times of crisis, we acted. We did things that were bold, that returned the sovereignty over money to its rightful place, that ensured that governments, we the people, create the money. This is what the whole, people don't know this, but the whole independence war with Britain, America's separated because they didn't want to be slaves to the London bankers. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, they said if the private banks ever become our masters, we will wake up as slaves. That's exactly what happened with the Federal Reserve System, which started in 1913. So Americans themselves have found themselves enslaved by a system that they actually fought against, right? So again, I think the only path forward, and the problem today is the whole world is in a debt musical chairs game. So there's one nation can't go alone. So the whole thing either has to be rebooted. There has to be a Congress, like a Bretton Woods kind of agreement is saying let's blow this whole thing up. If we did, well, how would we restructure it? We restructure it based on the lines of the Earth dollar. What we're proposing there, that the money now is tied to the nation's natural assets, right? That we're no longer trading stuff across oceans because that's just money changing hands. We're going to trade based on optimizing our ecological footprint, getting our balance with nature right, living off the interests of nature, not high grading it. Because the only reason we're high grading is because we're going to pay the interest payments on the accumulating debt, right? So that's why the GDP has to keep growing, just to service the debt payments. It's insane. It's a circular, right? It's an insane, mad circular system that there's no way out. But there's no conversations. Not in Paris, not in Davos, right? No one's having the bold conversation because everyone knows what's coming, I think, but they don't know what to do. Yeah.
Breaking.
So, again, I think Earth Dollar represents this kind of experiment, a parallel operating system. Maybe people will dismiss us as like crazies and dreamers, but we'll keep drumming and sitting in our sweat lodges and sitting with the Cookums and the grandmothers and being reminded by those wisdom keepers that we're not crazy.
And she holds us all.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm inspired by First Nations. As Shannon, as you know, I spend a lot of time with them, and they drive me crazy sometimes too. But they're damaged. They're like children who've been damaged for many generations, and I think, wow, like what? How come we can't? Let's get through this. Let's return to the. One of my favorite experiences of going to the Onondaga Longhouse in Syracuse, the Iroquois Confederacy, because I think Shannon, I shared this with you. I said I want to find one First Nation where the women are still a matrilineal structure, and I found one in the Onondaga, one of the fiercest independent nations in Turtle Island, who still have 49 clan mothers who maintain the power structure. They elect the chiefs for life, or have the right of recall. They're sitting on the other side of the room. The chiefs are the men are at the front, and the 49 headdresses are on the wall representing the clans, right? 5,000 people. And I'm like, this is a good model.
The thing is that I object to this. You mentioned that their children have been abused for generations, and what you're referring to is very visible. What I know to be true also is that the children of other races, of the races of us all, have been abused for so many generations, more than that, that we have healed, but we have healed scarred. And so we don't even feel the what the pain is anymore. We're so rigid now with scar tissue from the wounds that our ancestors have healed from, that we don't even know what it feels like for spirit to come through us. And so I am, while I am deeply affected by the pain that the Aboriginal peoples have endured the last half a dozen generations, the last 400 years, I am more deeply concerned for the majority of humanity that don't even know how wounded they are. And I think that realization that we can't even feel the hurt anymore is what we need to come to realize that we are so insulated from spirit by the scar tissue that this is really what we have to get in touch with. We have to cut scar tissue.
Absolutely, I think that's a beautiful reflection. It actually ties into the very Greek origins of the word happiness, which means, and sometimes we have all these debates about what happiness is, but Aristotle said happiness is oidaimonia. Eu means well-being, daimonia is spirit, right? The well-being of our soul, of our spirit, and we're not even in touch with that. What does that mean, right? And you're absolutely right. In the scar tissue, it's just so palpable when you're in a sweat lodge. You could feel the pain, right? And yet then there's music. Then there's the women singing in these frequencies. Shannon, you and I know. Like I'm this wacko guy that says, look, if we just hear the frequencies of the heart, the 522 hertz, if we get the right frequency of the, if the Nazis hadn't turned the A string tuning to 440 hertz, right, which all orchestras are now tuned to, that the A strings are discordant, then what happens? What happens when we hear the women singing in the sweat lodge at 427 hertz? What Verdi and Stradivarius said is a natural frequency. Do you know that that's the frequency of the pineal eye? That's why the Chinese torture drop is so effective, I think, because it's like, so what is it when we hear the music at 440 and it's discordant? It sounds okay, but it's actually blocking. Think about that.
On that note, I love how we can, This is the holistic nature, isn't it, of our conversation? When we start talking about economics and we end up on vibrational frequencies.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mark. We've got our next group coming up, or they're already here, with Unity, who are going to talk about the art of sharing. And yeah, really looking forward to that. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us.
Thank you.
Sharing your wisdom. I didn't get to ask you some of the questions that other questions that we had lined up, but if you feel like responding to those, and this is for all the speakers as well, we are mapping responses to those 4 questions in NewMap, and those responses to those questions are going to facilitate possibilities for synergistic co-creation.
Fantastic.
Seeing how we can support each other.
All right.
So yeah.
I'll check with Curtis, your IT guru, to find out how to do that.
Yes.
Excellent.
Excellent. Okay.
Have a blessed.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Cheers. Thank you. Okay.
So, you guys are going to move in.
Felipe.
All right.
Vieni qua.